Hey, welcome to What is the State For? This is a forum that Boston Review and Haymarket Books put together. I'm Femi Táíwò. I teach philosophy, political philosophy at Georgetown. I'm here with Tara Raghuveer. Do you want to say what you do?
Hi, so good to be here. My name is Tara Raghuveer, and I organize with the citywide tenant union in Kansas City called KC Tenants, and I also organize with tenant unions across the country.
Great. So if you have any questions or comments about the forum, some of you may have gotten a chance to read one or two of the essays that are in the forum already. You can submit those, and in a few minutes, Tara and I will get to responding to your questions. But some of you may have just been hearing about the forum, may not know what the issues are. So I'm going to start by just explaining the piece that I wrote that uh, started the discussion that's in the forum. I'll kick it over to Tara to explain her response, and then we'll have a conversation before we get to your questions. So the forum is called What is the State For? In the essay at the top, the Giant Steps essay, I put together what I think of as an argument, a kind of let's say a weak argument in favor of organizing with the state, right? Of viewing the state and the attempt to wield its power and the attempt to determine its political direction as sort of the defining political struggle of the 21st century. And the way that I set that up is I just talk about large scale political conflicts over the last couple of centuries, going back to the 18th century. So we haven't always had a planetary system of economics and politics. There have been very large trade networks in the past, over the Indian Ocean, over much of Europe and Asia, over much of the Americas. There have been very large schemes of cooperation and trade. But the idea of connecting politics and economics on a planetary scale is actually pretty new in human history, as far as we know. Economic historians tell us that's only been going around for the past 5 centuries or so. And out of those huge trade networks came this huge economic behemoth system that we have now that we call capitalism. And along with the advent of that was this other thing, the Industrial Revolution. And no matter who you talk to from right to left, if they're studying this on a scientific basis, they usually link global warming, climate change to the rise in emissions caused by the technological and energy system changes of that period, right? So we're dealing with something fairly unprecedented, unprecedented scales of politics, unprecedented scales of economic activity. And so this question of what to do on a planetary scale is a fairly new one, politically speaking. And generations of activists, generations of what we would today think of as the left, um, generations of anti-colonial activists, generations of socialists, generations of anarchists have tried to answer this question of what we're supposed to do on a planetary scale about our political situation. And there's always been a variety of responses. The most interesting one from my perspective um, was the one taken up by Haitian revolutionaries after the Haitian Revolution. Do we fit ourselves into this economic ecosystem that the French built over here, or do we detach from it and build something else? That kind of clash echoed in the political battles of the 1800s, of the 19th century. Right? So, do we side with Marx and Engels and the people that position themselves as inheritors of that legacy, and do we try to seize the state for the proletarian purposes, or do we try to smash the state for the proletarian purposes, right? So the anarchist versus socialist, anarchist versus communist classic divide. And then, as Emmanuel Wallerstein chronicles in the 20th century, in the 1900s, another version of that Of course, still the debate between socialists and anarchists, but also a debate in the anti-colonial movement between the people who wanted to seize the apparatus of the state, this new dominant political technology that rose in these last few centuries alongside capitalism. Do we want to seize that state and make it do what we want it to do, or do we need to somehow withdraw from state politics? And so the thing that I argue in this piece that leads off the forum is in the 21st century, the task before us is not directly about seizing or destroying the state, but it's actually a task about fossil capital as a fraction of the ruling class, as a fraction of the capitalist class, globally speaking. We're not going to be able to make headway on any of our goals for justice so long as the emissions and the political machinations around those emissions are driven by this fraction of capital. So whatever else we have to do, and there's a lot of other things that we have to do to get anything approaching justice in this century, we have to get rid of this fraction's control over the way that we meet our material needs, over the way that we produce energy, over the way that we produce our political decisions. So we need to get their political and economic power out of the picture. And it just so happens that a lot of the plausible ways of thinking about how to do that might involve directing the levers of power of the state, both its destructive powers to revoke fossil fuel licenses and its creative powers to direct patterns of investment that lead to different economic futures. And so there might be some other way to dethrone fossil capital, but dethroning fossil capital is the thing that we have to do. It's the question that this century is asking us. So that's the thing that I argued. There were a number of really good, really insightful responses, one of which was put together by Tara. So I'm going to pass it over to Tara to explain their view.
Thanks so much, Femi. So this was a really exciting essay to respond to, first of all, and one that I found overwhelming. There are so many directions to take a response to this. And one of the first directions that I decided to explore in my response to Femi's essay, Femi asserts that fossil capital and the struggle against fossil capital is should be the defining struggle of our time. And it occurred to me that we needed to also talk about real estate capital. So in my response to Femi, I make an argument for the idea that real estate capital is an accomplice to fossil capital and in many ways functions really similarly in determining our material reality, in kind of controlling the lives that we get to lead, in determining the future that we have for ourselves. And one of the other main similarities is actually the role that the state currently plays as an enabler in many ways of some of the destruction of both fossil capital and real estate capital. So I wanted to start by kind of contributing some analysis from the tenant movement to the sort of problem set that Femi presents to us. And I end up detailing in my response a lot of the evils of real estate capital as an accomplice of fossil capital and the ways in which they're connected and actually contribute to each other's evil. And there's a point in the essay where I'm sort of reckoning with the despair that analysis could lead us to, but also proposing that the kind of stark realities that I've outlined and Femi's outlined, all of that which might lead us to despair could also offer us a way out. The relationship between these evils and all that we're up against actually also give us a view into perhaps the only effective strategies to combat them, and that those strategies must be connected, and actually maybe more so now than ever before. So within that argument, I'm proposing the idea that we should consider the tenant and consider poor and working class people in labor unions, in tenant unions, as the protagonists of their own liberation, and start to get really serious about what it looks like for them to work together to define a new material reality for themselves. And I sort of don't contend with the question of the state until late in my response, but I spend some time thinking about and talking about what organizing actually needs to look like in response to all that we're up against. And, Femi has this great quote in his piece where he says, "We deserve better and we should want more, but it's the getting more, not the wanting, that's the problem." So I tried to focus on the getting more because I actually think we often get a little lost when it comes, the analysis might be there, but we get a little lost when it comes to thinking about what steps, baby steps and giant steps we could actually get, we could actually take to transform the world. So the argument that I pose there is that transforming the world requires organizing, not coalitions, not cute campaigns, not email lists, but actual organizing, meaning bringing people into organizations, politicizing them around their experience, developing leaders around us to gain skills and use those skills to make collective decisions, to take action together, to evaluate those actions, and then to act again. So that's sort of the broad definition of what could be possible within a union that I put forward. And I also argue that tenant unions are promising venues of such politicization and organizing, and that they're really underexplored. And that's part of my work as an organizer, is to explore the fullest potential of the tenant union. Tenant unions are starting to organize in more and more strategic ways across the country, and they're also more connected now than ever before, which is good. And we've kind of barely scratched the surface. So there's a lot left to be done. So then finally, at the end of my response, I get to this question of the state, and it's a little bit of a cop-out, but basically I assert that this question of whether we work within the state, outside of the state, in a relationship to the state to combat real estate capital and fossil capital and all that we're up against is really only a question that can be answered in a union, in practice, among people who are impacted by all of us are impacted by the harms of fossil capital and real estate capital, but people really on the front lines of that. And I assert that there's a lot of potential in grappling through these questions in the context of a union, because only in the context of a union or a different kind of power organization do we have the ability to fight back and take some of those baby steps and giant steps.
Yeah, thanks. So, and by the way, I heard from John, who's helping us out with this from Haymarket, that my microphone maybe wasn't easy to hear, so I've switched. Hopefully, you all let me know if this is any better. Any case, one of the things I found interesting about your response, and that I wanted to make sure to ask you about, was, I think the challenge put to my analysis by your focusing on tenants, right? So the way my story was supposed to go is, the state has the levers of power needed to check against capital. And those are, it's the only thing that has the scale to affect economic decisions at the relevant level. But I think focusing on tenant unions allows a more direct confrontation between people and capital, right? Especially as more and more real estate, as you're pointing out in the piece, right, gets bought up by big conglomerates, and tenant unions cooperating may actually be fighting corporations and investment portfolios that, deal with sizable amounts of real estate, sizable amounts of emissions, et cetera, right? So it's another very plausible story about how we get some purchase on fighting against fossil capital. So that's actually, that scale story is what I wanted to ask you about.
so you started to talk about it a little bit in your explanation, but what opportunities do you see in maybe the near future and maybe long term for collaborating across different tenants unions, and what kinds of things do you think that those kinds of collaborations might produce in terms of targets on the fossil capital side or the friends of fossil capital side?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I want to respond to is this, what you were saying about focusing on the tenant was sort of not exactly where you saw the story going. And I think in writing my response to you, I had to sort of undo some of my own thinking about how small scale the tenant or the tenant union felt in relationship to the really big questions you were posing about the state and the role of the state in combating fossil capital. And in pushing myself, I was like, no, I actually think I'm limiting my own thinking about the potential of the tenant union. And it's actually not just in the direction that you're talking about, Femi, which is like, yeah, tenants directly confronting capital. Tenant unions could also wield power on a whole set of other issues that aren't just related to their homes. And I think we see some good examples of this in organized labor today. You know, just yesterday, we saw 6 of the biggest unions in this country that represent more than half of organized laborers in this country demand a ceasefire and an end to America's involvement in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And that is unions acting in a way that takes seriously their workers and members as whole people who are interested in more than just their labor conditions in their workplace or their most direct relationship to capital, right? And I think tenant unions absolutely have the potential to become the kinds of vehicles for people to maybe initially become politicized on the basis of their material conditions in their homes, but then exercise political power, wield political power on a whole set of different questions. So just wanted to say that initially, because I think even in writing my response to you, I pushed my own thinking on that in really good, powerful directions. Tenant unions are starting to work more closely together now than they have in recent history. There's a long history of tenant unionism in the United States, and others are better equipped than I am to speak to that history specifically. What I can speak to is the contemporary landscape. There are a lot of tenant unions that have forged clarity in the last couple of years, especially since the early months and years of the pandemic. That this is the path. If we have a chance, the chance lives in the tenant union. So there's a kind of growing cadre of organizations across the country that are all, many of them are relatively young, not all, but many of them are relatively young and experimenting with what kind of feels like it needs to be a new practice of tenant organizing. The way that we have historically understood tenant organizing is that organizing happens in a building and maybe involves negotiation between a set of tenants in that building and their landlord. That, to me, and I think to a whole set of us, is a limited understanding of what the tenant union could be in today's reality. And actually, necessarily, we have to push beyond that understanding of the tenant union because of the forces of capital that we're up against. We cannot contest building by building, block by block. We must organize building by building, block by block, but we actually have to take our own power seriously enough that we're contesting at different levels of scale, at the neighborhood level, citywide, regionally, nationally, and even globally. So the contribution that we're making in that direction is, the local union that I'm a part of, KC Tenants. We are starting to build deeper relationship with other unions across the country. Some of those unions are now coming together to start to think about what it looks like to put together a federation of such unions and to actually build something that's bigger than the sum of its parts, not only to sharpen our organizing practice and to actually build a new practice of tenant organizing, but also to be able to wield the power of poor and working class tenants in a way that we maybe haven't seen in this country before.
I wanted to push you to say a little more about that, because I think, that's something that, at least as far as I know, in the U.S. context would
Yeah, it's a little robotic.
Okay. Let me see if I can turn off the. All right. Hopefully this will work better. Any better? Yeah, I switched to the computer audio. I can try the microphone audio.
The microphone audio. Let's see if that works. Okay. All right. Thank you. So I did want to ask, uh, on the level of what you're doing now in KC and with KC tenants, Kansas City, what are you seeing in terms of in terms of just one or two scales up from the building to building, block to block model? Um, and is that making you more optimistic about building even larger than that at the quote unquote federation level? Or are you seeing things that would need to get worked out before we could expand it even
It's a little bit of both, if I'm being honest with you. I think um, we're seeing a lot of potential, of course, which is why we're taking the steps that we are, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And it's difficult always to encounter a different organizational practice or a different methodology and try to figure out what's working about theirs and not working about yours, what's working about yours that you need to share with them. So there's some really good relational groundwork that's being laid right now, strategic groundwork that's being laid right now. And I think realistically, we're not going to see the fruits of some of this investment for a couple of years. Like, I think it's going to take some time to really finesse a new practice of organizing and spread it in the way that it needs to be spread if we're going to achieve the level of scale that we're aspiring for. So we're trying to be realistic with ourselves about what kind of time horizon we're actually working on. I think many of us, myself definitely included, are impatient to see the results of this type of collaboration sooner than later. But I think if we're serious about the question of power, and if we're serious about winning, and this crop of people that I'm now working with is very serious about both power and winning, then the thing that we have to be equally serious about is sort of deep inquiry and commitment to experimentation and refinement that is necessary before we declare we've got it figured out and here's how we do the thing. I think just the reality is that none of us have it figured out. The practice of tenant organizing is ours to create, and we're not creating it from scratch, but we do have to, we have to be rigorous in some of what's ahead of us. And then the possibility piece I do want to get back to, because I think even in the last couple of months, we felt a lot of possibility and potential, even in the beginnings of some of these deeper collaborations. And one of the examples of this is this summer, for example, we are running a strike readiness assessment across a set of properties with federally backed loans. And we're running that assessment knowing from the jump that we're probably not ready as a tenant movement. In fact, I can almost definitively say we are not ready as a tenant movement to execute a large scale national rent strike. And we will only get ready to do so if we start the process of assessing our readiness now and then understanding the power that we need to build to get there. And we need to get there. A rent strike is a tactic, and strategy actually needs to lead tactic, not the other way around. But it is the tactic that takes our power as tenants the most seriously, which is our rent check. So that's one of the areas of possibility and potential that I think is really only one we can explore in connection to other tenant unions. It's one that sort of takes us out of the weeds of our local context and forces us to grapple with what we're up against, which is organized capital that doesn't see state or city lines as limiting its power, and we can't accept state and city lines as limiting ours as a product of that.
Okay. So it looks like we have a few questions from the YouTube. Um, I want to continue our conversation, but work some of these questions in. And a couple of them might be directed at me, but I guess we'll see um, what we both have to say about them. But this first one asks, how do you see your argument about the importance of the state interacting with calls to return to indigenous land practices and their alternative ways of relating with the natural world, especially in the face of climate crisis? Um, this is something I've thought a lot about. Interested, Tara, what you have to say about it. But just to start off with what I think, uh, I actually think that the interaction of the importance of the state with calls for return to indigenous land practices needs to be understood in the context of calls with the return of indigenous land. Right. So the state of California, I lived in California for a little while, so I was just trying to see what was going on with these things. Um, there has been a not that large scale, but significant return of land to the Shasta Nation. There has been, I believe, a co-management agreement reached between the National Park Service and Yurok Nation. And I think the question of sovereignty and control and the question of those things being the kind of standard mechanisms of the state, and then the question of how power is shared over a territory and whether or not that power is returned, I think is where I would kind of start my thoughts about the relationship of land practices, right? Rather than just trying to learn how indigenous nations managed land or manage land in the present and then taking those technologies for the state. Right? I think um, the the way I'd rather situate it is in that kind of discussion. And whatever critiques, and I'm sure there are critiques, whatever critiques there are of that particular land return or that particular land co-management between Yurok Nation and the National Park Service, I think people fought pretty hard to remove the kind of unilateral U.S. sovereignty over those acres and try out some other kind of decision-making system. And those are the questions that we're going to have to ask. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that um, kind of following Tara's analysis, we should see real estate as a competitor in that process, right? As a kind of third party, right? Private developers, private landlords, private corporations that make speculative investments on land and water rights are also an attempt to insert a governance system over large territories of land, the kind of direct governance of capital rather than the indirect governance through the mechanisms of the state. And the more we can politically outpace that competitor, even if it means, trying to figure out some kind of détente with the state, the better. Tara, is there anything you wanted to say in response to this question? Okay.
No, I'm kind of taking in what you shared. Yeah, super important question. And yeah, just want to put it out there that in a number of indigenous communities across the country, indigenous leaders are organizing tenant unions. And some of them are ones we're connected to, and some of them we're not yet. But I think there's, very obvious connections between our struggles for our home and our struggles for land and sovereignty.
So let me move to Another question, this one is for Tara. So, how do you bridge the gap between the struggle for immediate needs, like rent strikes, and the broader struggle against real estate capital in the day to day? Is it about education, strategic targets, or other stuff?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think I'll start by saying most of our campaigning at the local level and nationally is campaigning that follows a kind of particular strategic tradition, which is that we first articulate a North Star. So it's important to us to know where we're going in order to determine the steps that we need to take to get there. And I think on an issue like housing, but also on issues like climate and many other issues, the reason it's important to have that kind of orientation to campaigning and to strategy is because some of the immediate steps that might present themselves to us that might seem good and like the right steps for us to take are actually steps that entrench us in the system that we are critiquing. On housing, I'll give you an example, which is that a step that sounds good to a lot of people, elected officials, but also everyday people, is that every tenant should get a voucher. Okay, maybe like, some assistance from the government to help you pay your rent. Our critique of that idea or that step is that a voucher for a tenant to rent in the private market only expands the role of the private market in control of our homes. And it amounts to an even further transfer of public resources to private profits. So while there might be some arguments for harm reduction, get people housed today by giving them this voucher, the trouble is that it just expands and enlarges the role of real estate capital in determining our material outcomes. So a different kind of step in the kind of immediate term in the world as it is would be regulating the private market through something like rent controls. That's actually something that we can do nationally and otherwise, although at the local level it becomes complicated because a lot of state legislatures have already outlawed that. But rent regulation actually becomes a way that we look at all of the ways that the state is already in bed with our landlords, and we say every dollar of that money should come with strings attached. The landlord should be on the hook for tenant protections that actually keep people in their homes. So that's just one way that we might think about the immediate steps that we take in line with a longer term strategy. Our longer term strategy, our North Star, is decommodified housing. Housing should be guaranteed as a public good and a right, not commodified or treated as an investment for someone to make a profit. The world we live in today, housing is treated as a commodity. So we have to take seriously the world as it should be, the world as it is, the distance between, and then also take steps accordingly so that we're moving in the direction of our North Star and not in the opposite direction. Someone I always like to quote on this is the Brazilian popular educator Paulo Freire, who asked, what can we do today so that tomorrow we can do what we cannot do today? And that is actually a much more concise summary of our campaigning strategy and some of the strategy that informs the moves that we make.
I think that point is a good segue to an earlier question that was asked that I think is, that I imagine we'll both have something to say in response to. So the question says, the state has the levers to affect capital, yes, and its most powerful levers are used for capital accumulation, expansion, and legitimization. Do you think the state can exist outside of class rule? And I think as I try to acknowledge in the essay, and I think all of us from our different kind of perspectives try to acknowledge, I think we need to be aware of and clear-eyed about the limits of what the people that occupy the state are interested in doing, and what the state as an institution is capable of doing, and in what kinds of discipline capital can impose on the state. Right? I think we have to be serious about all those things. I think those should sharply attenuate, should sharply discipline our imagination about what can be accomplished by way of the state, as should, of course, the dismal history of what states have actually done. So I don't, in any way, shape, or form, want to give the impression that I'm not taking all of that seriously. But to answer the question directly, do I think the state can exist outside of class rule? Um, I don't know. I think we should try it. I, Lenin and them gave it a shot. Why shouldn't we? That's not to say that um, everything the question asks isn't true. That the levers of the state are used for capital accumulation, expansion, legitimization. Um, but even if it's necessarily true and not just contingently true, and not even just overwhelmingly likely to be true, if the state is just a way of organizing human activity that is incompatible with abolishing classes, with abolishing capitalism, I still think the question of in what sense and what strategies the state uses to pursue capital accumulation, expansion, and legitimization. I still think the questions internal to the how story and the what version of that story we get are meaningful, right? Norway, Saudi Arabia, and China are all major producers of emissions, but they have drastically different political systems. They have different strategies for extending that capital accumulation. And life is different for the people that live in those three countries. We could add the United States as as the biggest fossil fuel producer, right? And that's not to say that we should want any of those four models, but it is to say that the question of whether or not class rule has been eliminated is not the only political question to answer. And one of the political questions to answer in the 21st century is the scale of emissions compatible with continuing to wield political victories, right? Is it compatible with us retaining the possibility tomorrow of doing something better, both something better than the internal combustion engine and something better than the state? And when we ask that question, I'm really drawn to that quote that Tara just gave us, right? What are we going to do today to make something that's impossible today possible tomorrow? I know I'm butchering the quote, but that's the kind of thing we should be thinking about. Tara, do you have something on this?
Yeah, I think I just largely agree with you. I end my essay with a simple and almost like pleading line, but it really was the only thing that felt appropriate. I said, we have to try. We have to try. And I think, Femi lays this out really clearly in his piece, in making the argument for the state as a venue for this struggle against fossil capital. And yeah, it's undeniable that the state is captured by capital. And I think it's not a question of should we try to contest against that? Should we try to recapture the state from capital? It's actually more that we must try, because of all the reasons that Femi laid out around scale and the opportunity for only the state to act in the ways that we need it to. And I do think it requires a level of discipline and clarity. As you were saying, Femi, we cannot be under any illusions about how difficult that premise is. And that's why, I'm such a hater about things like email lists and coalition politics and stuff like that, because it's like we just have to be very serious every day about the kind of power it's going to take to recapture the state, to reorganize ourselves to truly contest against capital. Like what we are up against are the most potent forces in the world. So we can't be cute about it, right? There's nothing cute about the tenant unions we need to build. They can't be social groups. They can't be, community organizations where we hang out and make friends. Maybe we make friends along the way to really contesting for power. So, yeah, I think it's less a question of like, should we engage the state? Should we try to recapture the state? We actually just have to try. We have to try, and then we probably have to try again and again until we get what we want. And I also think that doesn't actually mean contorting ourselves into actors within some state apparatus. It means organizing ourselves outside of the state to force the outcome that we require. And that's sort of my project as an organizer of tenant unions. It might be easy in some way to go on the inside and decide to start talking about rent control. And I know we're not going to get rent control by asking nicely. We're actually only going to get rent control by forcing a crisis in the world as we know it today. And we're only going to get that by organizing.
This is another question from the chat that I think is along the same lines as the one we've just answered, but pushing us on a different point, which is that the thing we're talking about, trying to force outcomes from the state and or trying to kind of absorb the state into a different project, both of those things have been tried. Right? So here's what the question says. I'll read it now. Would what is being imagined here look different than earlier post-colonial efforts at either taking over or building new states? And my thoughts about this are, I could blab about this forever, but I'll just start off by saying I hope so. With all due respect to the great victories that were won in the national independence movements and the great sacrifices that were required to win those victories, I think, nevertheless, many of us would agree that the results of many post-colonial states have not been uh, what we would hope, right? Um, but even with that said, I think there is a good set of reasons to think that what's being imagined here, that the efforts being imagined here must, for the reasons Tara was just saying, must be tried again, but also that we actually should expect a much different set of responses this time around. And I will just confine myself to just pointing out that uh, we are out of the Cold War, right? And the trajectory of many of the post-colonial states, I think, owed a lot to not just a kind of realpolitik level competition between the first world and the second world for hearts and minds in the third world, but actually a real ideological competition, right? The first world versus the second world was supposed to be equivalent to capitalism versus communism, the American way versus the Soviet way, whatever. And there was a real kind of allergy to experimentation of a certain kind that I think probably owed itself at least a little bit to that kind of zero sum, artificially zero sum binary uh, geopolitical situation that many people tried to set in various ways, but that nevertheless imposed itself via the competition between the US and the USSR. All of which is to say, I think there is a more open field now for states to take different directions. And I think there's a lot less interest and a lot less possibility, honestly, from even the most powerful states today to kind of direct the development of states um, to the same degree as was attempted during the Cold Whether or not that will translate into new experiments in the pursuit of justice versus new experiments in, new experiments and bespoke kinds of oppression is a question down to who wins politically, whether it's the movements that we're aligned with or whether it's uh, the forces of capital. But I think there is at least the possibility of different directions these days. Do you have something on this, Tara?
No, you're way better to respond to this question than me, so we can move on.
Okay. Let's see. So there are a few more questions in the chat. I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but here's one. Here's one that maybe we'll both have something to say to. So this question says, the U.S. Constitutional Convention said that the point of the state is to, quote, to protect the minority of the opulence from the majority, unquote. How much do you think the state has changed since its founding? It's an interesting one. Do you want to take a crack at this one?
I'm still processing that quote. You should take a first stab. I got to think for a second.
Yeah. So I'm not familiar with this quote, but I guess just reacting to the idea, has anything changed in terms of protecting the minority of the opulent from the majority, or it seems to be the kind of tyranny of the mob sort of worry that some of the founders have, right? So maybe the idea that the quote is getting at is we have all of these fancy institutions to protect, the elites from the rabble, and that's how the U.S. was founded. Um, and I think that ethos is, obviously still with us today, but it's almost worse in a sense, right? Where I shouldn't say worse, but it's different. Where what I think there was at least an attempt, certainly amongst white settlers, to foster a sense of solidarity in the U.S., right? A sense of somewhat shared destiny. And the idea was that the greatness of the nation and the greatness of its rich people and biggest landowners were somehow intertwined. And I think that even carried through, to the Cold War, right? The American way, not just Coca-Cola Inc. But nowadays, it seems like it's a kind of fire sale on the U.S. where really what they're protecting is the right of the richest people to scam and maximally exploit uh, everybody else. And there's no real vision of national greatness on the other side of that. It's just, keep the taxes low, keep the IRS underfunded, and don't look too closely at the activity of any of the slumlords. And, I don't think that's worse than slavery, but I don't think that is better than what we should want a genuinely democratic system of governance to do. Uh, and, maybe the people out there, especially on the right wing, really leaning to the idea of a republic and that being different from a genuine democracy. Maybe that's what they're trying to say. They don't really think that they should have to respond to everybody else or manage the institutions of the public for the general benefit of people as opposed to the private benefit of a few well-positioned people. So that was a very ranty answer, but hopefully I said something responsive to the question in the last 3 minutes.
Yeah, I don't have tons to add. I'm still sort of processing that quote. I mean, I think the one thing I will say is that while I believe Femi's argument about the centrality and the necessity of the state to act in relationship to fossil capital and real estate capital, and I believe in the necessity of us to get organized and force the state to act in the way that we want it to. I also believe in people's ability to act outside of the state in ways that are powerful and self-preserving. I'm thinking about one example I know from my local context, which is that there's a part of Kansas City, Kansas called Quindaro. And that was actually a place where Indigenous people, white abolitionists, and more came together. Kansas was a free state and Missouri was a slave state, and they came together outside of the premise of the state and facilitated slave escapes. And a lot of escaping slaves who came on the Missouri River landed in Quindaro. There's so many examples of that from history, of like people acting from a place of conviction and volition outside of what is allowable by the state. And in so many situations, we actually create our own states in a way. Like the tenant union is a kind of democratic state in its own right. So anyway, I think we actually have to do both, like fixate on the role of the state, especially when we're thinking about problems as big as the ones that Femi has laid out in his essay. And we need to take our own kind of non-state activity seriously enough that is not the beginning and end of how we think about how people can get organized. And I don't actually know that that's responsive at all to this quote that you put in the chat, but just some of what came up for me as Femi was responding.
I think that links to another question that will be a good question to end on. That is pushing on a similar vein, but directing our attention to capital rather than the state. So the question says, to push a little bit, how do we deal with all the tools other than the state by which capital can exert its power? How do we break those? And this one might be good for this. I'm interested what you have to say, Tara, just given that you're working in a tenants union and with tenants unions, right? So dealing with a lot of the other, machinery that capital has to deal with people beyond the state. Is there anything that you have to
Yeah,
say?
I mean, I think, I don't know it's a satisfying answer, but I think we break those tools by breaking them, like by actually figuring out how to break them. That's one of the things that we're trying to do through this strike readiness assessment, is figure out how we actually create a crisis in this market that's been set up by the state, enabled by the state, overseen by the state, theoretically regulated by the state, but it's, the state actors are concerned with what they call the safety and soundness of the market. And what they really mean by that is the safety and soundness of the market for the capitalists to keep doing what they're doing in the market and to keep making the money that they need to make to deliver for their investors. What they're not saying is they're interested in the safety and soundness for tenants, right? So I think part of what we're trying to do is figure out how we break that tool, right? That tool of capital, how we break that market, how we actually might create such chaos and intervene in the flow of capital in that market to the extent that the tool is broken, and we actually then have to consider how we move forward. And even then the job is not done, right? Because what we've seen time and time again, we saw this in response to the global economic crisis created by organized capital in 2008. Capital will sort of like shapeshift and recreate different kinds of tools to protect itself. So even when we break the tool, the job is not done. We actually have to come ready with our vision for a different way of orienting the state. But yeah, I think it's at once as simple and as complicated as like we break the tools by breaking the tools, by building the strategies to actually mess up everything that capital enjoys.
Can't think of a better note to end on than that. So let's have that be the last question, but I know that you wanted to mention the launch event.
Yeah. So the tenant unions that are getting together and starting to organize more closely together than ever before, we're actually launching a tenant union federation on August 6th. It'll be a virtual event. Hopefully, Femi's going to be there. I owe him a text message about what his role is going to be. But hopefully, many of you can join us as well. It's going to be a good gathering, hopefully the first of many, to sort of share the direction that we're headed, get feedback on it, and take our first baby steps towards some of these giant steps to transform the world.
Hope to see y'all there. Thanks for coming to this event. Thanks, Tara. Thanks, John. And we will hope to see you in the future. Take care.